On the morning of November 25th, 1940, inside a magnificent Georgian mansion nestled in the quiet greenery of Hertfordshire, a tall, gaunt man sat alone at his mahogany desk. His name was Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. Outside his window, the late autumn fog hung thick over the grounds of Bentley Priory, the operational headquarters of Royal Air Force Fighter Command. For 4 harrowing months, this room had been the nerve center of the free world. From this desk, Dowding had directed the most consequential air battle in human history. He had stood against the seemingly unstoppable tide of Nazi Germany, orchestrated the defeat of Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe, and saved Great Britain from total destruction. Yet on this morning, there was no fanfare. There were no crowds of grateful citizens, and there were no telegrams of praise from the Prime Minister. Instead, Dowding held an official letter from the Air Ministry. It was terse, cold, and brutally direct.
It informed him that he was being relieved of his command immediately and was required to vacate his office by the end of the day. There was no offer of a new military post, no recognition of his extraordinary achievement, and no formal expression of gratitude. After 40 years of military service, the man who had just saved Western civilization was being quietly shown the door.
How could a leader who had just delivered one of the most vital military victories in recorded history be discarded so ruthlessly? The answer lies not in the sky, where his pilots had fought with legendary heroism, but in the dark, carpeted corridors of Whitehall, where envy, political maneuvering, and bitter professional rivalries raged unchecked. Hugh Dowding was never a man built for politics. He was a cold, aloof, and uncompromising technician who refused to play the courtier to politicians or tell his superiors what they wanted to hear. Long before the battle began, he had fought a silent, desperate war against his own government to build the system that would eventually save the realm. And when victory was finally won, those he had angered, bypassed, and humiliated saw their opportunity to strike. This is the story of the pilot, engineer, and commander who won the Battle of Britain, and the calculated betrayal that ensured he would never be allowed to enjoy his triumph.
To understand how Hugh Dowding saved Britain, one must first understand the deeply unconventional man behind the uniform. Born in 1882 in the Scottish town of Moffat, Dowding was the son of a schoolmaster. He was educated at Winchester College and the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, embarking on a military career that initially seemed destined for the artillery. But in 1913, fascinated by the nascent technology of aviation, he earned his pilot's license at his own expense and joined the Royal Flying Corps. During the First World War, Dowding served with distinction as a squadron commander on the Western Front. Yet even then, his prickly nature and rigid adherence to principle brought him into sharp conflict with his superiors. He openly criticized senior commanders, including General Hugh Trenchard, for sending poorly trained young pilots into combat in inferior, hazardous aircraft. He earned a reputation for being difficult, obstinate, and overly protective of his men. It was during this period that his fellow officers gave him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: Stuffy. Stuffy Dowding was not an easy man to like at first glance. He was severe, formal, and possessed a voice that rarely rose above a calm, monotone whisper. He did not drink heavily. He disliked small talk, and he harbored a profound distrust for political showmanship. He was a lonely, emotionally isolated figure, deeply scarred by the premature death of his young wife Clarice in 1920, which left him to raise their infant son alone. Yet beneath his icy, withdrawn exterior lay a mind of extraordinary analytical precision, a radical openness to technological innovation, and an abiding, almost paternal love for the young airmen under his charge. To the politicians in London, he was a stubborn, humorless bureaucrat who lacked charm and social grace. To the young fighter pilots who would soon fly into the sun, he was the quiet guardian who refused to waste their lives for political theatre.
By the mid-1930s, as the shadow of Nazi Germany began to stretch across Europe, The prevailing doctrine of military aviation was dictated by a grim, fatalistic consensus. Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, had famously declared to Parliament that the bomber will always get through. Military strategists across the globe believed that there was no reliable defense against a massed aerial attack. The speed and altitude of modern bombers meant that traditional anti-aircraft guns were largely ineffective, and fighter aircraft patrolling the skies at random had virtually no chance of intercepting enemy formations in time. The accepted strategy was purely offensive. Build a massive fleet of heavy bombers to inflict counter-destruction on the enemy's cities, creating a deterrent through mutual annihilation. When Dowding was appointed to head the newly created RAF Fighter Command in July 1936, he refused to accept this fatalism. He believed that an effective defense was not only possible, but absolute vital for Britain's survival as an island nation. But building that defense required a complete revolution in how air warfare was conceived and executed. Dowding realized that single flight patrols were a recipe for disaster. What Britain needed was not just airplanes, but an integrated technological organism, a system that could detect an incoming raid long before it reached the coast, track its movement in real time, and direct interceptor fighters straight to the enemy with mathematical precision. Over the next 4 years, with a stubborn tenacity that exasperated his colleagues, Dowding assembled what history would come to know as the Dowding System. It was the world's first integrated, ground-controlled air defense network, and it was a marvel of modern engineering. At its heart was a breakthrough technology that had only recently emerged from secret government laboratories overseen by scientist Robert Watson Watt: radar, then known as radio direction finding. Along the eastern and southern coasts of Britain, Dowding oversaw the construction of Chain Home, a network of tall, 300-foot steel transmitter towers that projected an invisible curtain of high-frequency radio waves far out over the North Sea and the English Channel. When enemy aircraft flew into this curtain, the radio waves bounced back, revealing their location, distance, altitude, and approximate size. To make this raw information useful, Dowding designed an astonishingly complex command and control apparatus. The raw radar data was not sent directly to the fighter squadrons, which would have resulted in chaos and conflicting orders. Instead, it was funneled into a central filter room at Bentley Priory. There, trained operators cross-referenced the radar plots with reports from coastal radio stations and the visual sightings of the Observer Corps, filtering out errors and establishing a single, coherent picture of the sky. From the filter room, the verified information was simultaneously transmitted down to the operations rooms of 4 regional fighter groups, and then to individual sector stations across the country. Inside these operations rooms, young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force sat around giant map-covered tables. Using long wooden croupier sticks, they pushed colored counters across the maps, representing incoming enemy raids and friendly fighter squadrons. Above the tables, group commanders sat in glass-walled galleries, watching the battle unfold before their eyes with absolute clarity. Through a vast network of underground post office telephone cables and high-frequency radio links, controllers could talk directly to pilots in their cockpits, vectoring them toward enemy bombers before the attackers even crossed the coastline. Alongside this command network, Dowding fought ruthlessly for the hardware his system required. He championed the development and mass production of 2 revolutionary monoplane fighters, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. Designed by genius engineers Sidney Cam and R.J. Mitchell and powered by Sir Henry Royce's formidable liquid-cooled Merlin engine, these aircraft provided the speed, maneuverability and firepower needed to destroy modern metal bombers. Yet even as these brilliant machines rolled off the assembly lines, Dowding knew that the ultimate bottleneck of his force was not aluminium, radio sets or engines, but human beings. A Spitfire could be built in weeks. A fighter pilot took months to train.
Every decision he made was calibrated to conserve the precious human capital of fighter command. In May 1940, Dowding System faced its first and most terrifying test, not over the white cliffs of Dover, but across the English Channel, in the collapsing nation of France. The German Wehrmacht had unleashed its blitzkrieg, smashing through Allied lines with devastating speed. As French defences crumbled, panic seized the British government and military leadership. The French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, pleaded frantically with Winston Churchill for more British fighter squadrons to be thrown into the battle over France. Churchill, desperate to keep France in the war and maintain the Allied alliance, was inclined to grant the request. Senior figures in the Air Ministry and the War Cabinet pressed Dowding to send squadron after squadron across the Channel to stem the German advance.
Dowding recognized this as a deadly trap. The war in France was already lost. The British fighters sent into the French sky were operating far outside the coverage of their home radar network and ground control. They were being overwhelmed by superior German numbers, shot down over enemy territory, or destroyed on poorly defended forward airfields. Between May 10th and May 14th, Fighter Command lost over 200 aircraft, a rate of attrition that, if sustained for another fortnight, would leave Britain completely defenseless. On May 15th, 1940, Dowding took a step that required a rare form of moral courage. He demanded an audience with the War Cabinet. Entering the Cabinet room at 10 Downing Street, the austere Air Chief Marshal laid out a stark, uncompromising mathematical reality. He had calculated that an absolute minimum of 52 operational fighter squadrons were required to defend the home territory of Great Britain against a German air attack. Due to the catastrophic losses in France, his force was already down to 36. If more squadrons were sent to France, he warned, the RAF would be destroyed piecemeal, and when the inevitable German air assault on Britain began, there would be nothing left to defend the island. When his verbal pleas were met with hesitation by politicians still desperate to placate the French, Dowding penned a famous letter to the Air Ministry that remains one of the classic documents of military history. With cold, surgical logic, he wrote, "If the Home Defence Force is drained away in desperate attempts to remedy the situation in France, a defeat in France will involve the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of this country." He stated unequivocally that not another single fighter squadron should leave British soil. Churchill was furious at Dowding's intransigence, but the sheer, unassailable logic of his argument prevailed. The Cabinet yielded. Dowding's stubbornness slammed the door on further fighter deployments to France. 2 weeks later, during the desperate evacuation at Dunkirk, Fighter Command provided a thin, protective umbrella over the beaches, suffering heavy losses but preserving the vital core of its strength. When France fell in June 1940, Britain stood alone in Europe. But thanks to Hugh Dowding, the shield of Fighter Command remained intact. Adolf Hitler now turned his gaze across the English Channel. To launch Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious invasion of the British Isles, the German High Command knew they had to achieve total air superiority over the Channel and southern England. If the RAF remained operational, British fighters and the Royal Navy would slaughter the vulnerable German invasion barges long before they could reach the beaches. The commander of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, boasted to Hitler that his air force would annihilate Fighter Command in a matter of weeks. In July 1940, the Battle of Britain began. The early phase, known as the Kanalkampf, saw the Luftwaffe launch ferocious attacks against British merchant shipping convoys in the English Channel. Göring hoped to lure Fighter Command into a war of attrition over the water, where British pilots shot down could not be rescued, and where the RAF would be forced to expend its strength far from its home bases. Dowding saw through Göring's strategy immediately. He issued strict orders to his group commanders: do not swallow the bait. He refused to send large formations of fighters to defend minor coastal convoys, saving his forces for the primary defense of the homeland.
This refusal to engage on enemy terms angered some of his own aggressive young officers and political critics in London, who accused him of excessive caution and cowardice. But Dowding remained unmoved. He knew that every Spitfire lost over the middle of the Channel was a permanent loss, whereas a pilot who bailed out over Kent or Sussex could be back in a cockpit before sunset.
On August 13, 1940, Goering unleashed Adlertag, Eagle Day, marking the start of a massive, concentrated air offensive designed to destroy the RAF on the ground and in the air. Hundreds of German bombers, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, crossed the Channel in giant waves. Their targets were the sector airfields, radar stations and aircraft factories of southern England. For the young men of Fighter Command, the summer of 1940 became a terrifying blur of endless scrambles, screaming engines, and the smell of high-octane fuel and cordite. The average age of a British fighter pilot was just 22. They flew 4, 5, sometimes 6 combat sorties a day, landing only to rearm and refuel before being hurled back into the sky. Exhaustion was so profound that pilots would fall asleep on the grass beside their planes, engine noise ringing in their ears, waiting for the piercing blare of the dispersal loudspeaker to call them back to battle.
Inside the quiet sanctuary of Bentley Priory, Dowding bore an unbearable emotional burden. Though he rarely showed his feelings to the public, he was tormented by the casualties among his chicks, as he privately called his young airmen. Every evening, he reviewed the kill and loss lists with painstaking attention. He knew that the margins of victory were razor-thin. Fighter Command was losing pilots faster than the operational training units could produce them. Airfields in Kent and Surrey were being pitted with bomb craters, their operations rooms destroyed, their communications cables severed. Yet through it all, Dowding's system held. The chain home radar towers, despite being repeatedly bombed, stayed on the air, their maintenance crews repairing damage under heavy fire. The plotting tables continued to track the German raids, and the RAF continued to meet the attackers in the sky.
As the desperate struggle reached its peak in late August, an insidious poison began to spread within the senior leadership of Fighter Command itself. It was a tactical debate that would degenerate into one of the most toxic feuds in British military history. The controversy over the Big Wing.
To understand the conflict, one must look at how Fighter Command was geographically organized. The heaviest burden of the battle fell on 11 Group, which covered London and the crucial southeast corner of England. 11 Group was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, a brilliant, energetic New Zealander who was Dowding's most trusted lieutenant. Park shared Dowding's tactical philosophy completely. Because his airfields were closest to the French coast, Park had only minutes of warning when radar detected incoming German raids. His tactic was to scramble small, nimble formations, single squadrons or pairs of squadrons, as quickly as possible. These fighters would climb steeply to intercept the enemy bombers before they reached their targets, breaking up their formations and disrupting their bombing runs.
To the north of London lay 12 Group, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. Leigh-Mallory was an ambitious, vain and politically connected officer who deeply resented playing a supporting role in the battle. While 11 Group was fighting for its life, 12 Group was tasked primarily with protecting 11 Group's northern airfields and industrial centres in the Midlands.
Leigh-Mallory, strongly influenced by one of his star squadron leaders, the legendary legless ace Douglas Bader, advocated a completely different approach. They argued that scrambling single squadrons was a wasteful, piecemeal tactic. Instead, they proposed assembling massive formations of 3, 4, or 5 squadrons, a big wing of 30 to 60 fighters, before flying south to attack the German raids. They claimed that a big wing would strike overwhelming terror into the enemy, shooting down vast numbers of German aircraft with minimal British losses. On paper, the big wing sounded magnificent, aggressive and decisive. But in practice, it possessed a fatal flaw. Assembling 3 or 4 squadrons into a single coherent formation required airplanes to take off from different airfields.
rendezvous over a specific visual landmark, and form up in the sky. This process took anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. In the fast-moving air war over southeast England, 45 minutes was an eternity. While Leigh-Mallory's big wing was slowly circling over Cambridgeshire, trying to get into formation, German bombers were already dropping their payloads on 11 Group's airfields, bombing factories, and escaping back across the Channel unmolested. Time and again, Keith Park called upon 12 Group to send fighters down to cover his vulnerable airfields, while his own squadrons were engaged. Time and again, Leigh-Mallory delayed, taking precious time to form his big wing, leaving Park's airfields wide open to destruction. When Park complained bitterly about these delays, Leigh-Mallory refused to alter his tactics. Instead, he began compiling massive claims of German planes shot down by his big wing during its rare engagements, numbers that were dramatically exaggerated, though believed at the time by an eager air ministry hungry for good news. Leigh-Mallory found a powerful ally in the air ministry. Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas, the Vice Chief of the Air Staff. Douglas was an ambitious courtier who had long coveted Dowding's job. Together, Leigh-Mallory and Douglas began whispering in the ears of politicians and senior commanders, presenting the big wing as the true, aggressive weapon of victory, and painting Dowding and Park as timid, outdated bureaucrats who were mishandling the defense of the nation. Dowding was fully aware of the mathematical flaws of the big wing. He knew Park's quick interception tactics were the only reason southern England had not been overwhelmed. But Dowding made a tragic error of leadership. He refused to publicly crush the rebellion. Exhausted, emotionally drained, and temperamentally averse to open conflict with his subordinates, Dowding tried to manage the dispute through mild diplomacy and quiet memos, hoping his officers would resolve their differences rationally. He underestimated the sheer malice and personal ambition of his opponents. Leigh-Mallory and Sholto Douglas realized that Dowding's political standing was fragile, and they moved in for the kill. While the political storm brewed in London, the physical battle reached its absolute crisis point. By the end of August 1940, Fighter Command was nearing total collapse. Between August 24th and September 6th, the RAF lost nearly 300 fighters destroyed and over 170 severely damaged, while more than 100 pilots were killed and dozens wounded. Worse still, 6 of 11 Group's 7 main sector stations had suffered catastrophic damage. The vital sector control rooms, crammed with delicate communications cables, were being pulverized. Fighter Command was running out of operational airfields, running out of experienced sector controllers, and running out of pilots. Then, at the supreme moment of peril, a fateful twist of history altered the trajectory of the war. On the night of August 24th, a small formation of German bombers, lost in the dark over England, accidentally dropped their bombs on the centre of London, violating strict orders from Hitler that the British capital was not to be targeted without his express permission. In retaliation, Winston Churchill ordered an immediate RAF bomber raid on Berlin. Though the damage to the German capital was minor, the psychological shock to the Nazi regime was immense. Goering was disgraced, and an enraged Hitler publicly vowed to erase British cities from the earth. On September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe made a catastrophic strategic error. They suddenly shifted their main objective away from the destruction of RAF airfields and sector stations, redirecting their full power toward the terror bombing of London. This shift, which marked the beginning of the Blitz, brought immense tragedy to the civilian population of London. But for Fighter Command, it was an absolute miracle. It provided Keith Park's battered airfields and sector stations an immediate, life-saving reprieve. Ground crews labored around the clock to repair craters, restring telephone lines, and restore the operational integrity of the Dowding System. And because German bombers were now flying all the way to London, they were operating at the absolute limit of their fuel range, giving British fighters more time to intercept them. The ultimate climax of the battle arrived on Sunday, September 15th, 1940, a date now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day. On that crisp autumn morning, Goering launched a massive, all-out assault, sending over 500 bombers and fighters toward London in two giant waves. He believed that Fighter Command was down to its last 50 planes, and that one final massive blow would crush British resistance forever. In the underground bunker at Uxbridge, the operational headquarters of 11 Group, Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood beside Keith Park, watching the giant plotting table. As the red markers representing German raids flooded across the mapboard, Park ordered squadron after squadron into the air. Every light on the group status board glowed red, indicating that every single unit was committed to battle. Churchill turned to Park and asked, "What other reserves have we?" Park looked at the Prime Minister and quietly replied, "None." It was the absolute tipping point. Every available Spitfire and Hurricane in southern England was in the air, engaging the enemy in a titanic dogfight over the streets of London and the fields of Kent. The Luftwaffe encountered a wall of fire. The Dowding System functioned with flawless perfection, guiding British fighters directly into the path of the German formations. Even Leigh-Mallory's 12-group Big Wing, scrambled early enough due to the longer flight path to London, arrived to join the slaughter. The Luftwaffe was decimated. Expecting an empty sky, German crews were shattered to find dozens of British fighters diving on them from out of the sun. The RAF claimed over 180 German aircraft destroyed that day. Though post-war records revealed the actual number was 56, the psychological impact on the German High Command was fatal. 2 days later, on September 17th, 1940, Adolf Hitler recognized the inescapable truth. The RAF was not destroyed. Its strength seemed undiminished, and its defense network was unbreakable. Reluctantly, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was cancelled. The Battle of Britain had been won. In any rational military system, the commander who had just orchestrated the most decisive defense in modern warfare would have been showered with national honors, promoted to the highest ranks, and celebrated as a national hero. Instead, the knives were drawn. Hugh Dowding's victory had made his political enemies in the Air Ministry not grateful, but deeply embarrassed and furious. For months, figures like Sholto Douglas, Trafford Leigh-Mallory, and the Under-Secretary of State for Air, Harold Balfour, had been quietly claiming that Dowding was past his prime, that his tactics were outdated, and that his failure to use the big wing was allowing German bombers to escape. The fact that Dowding had proven them wrong on the field of battle only deepened their resentment. Furthermore, Dowding had exhausted his political capital. He was almost 60 years old, bone-weary from 4 years of relentless, unyielding work and suffering from physical and emotional fatigue. He was not a charismatic figure who could dominate a committee room or charm the press. When questioned by politicians, he remained taciturn, aloof, and disdainful of their military ignorance. On October 17, 1940, while the night blitz was beginning to rain fire on British cities, the Air Ministry staged an extraordinary trap. A formal meeting was convened at the Air Ministry in London to discuss fighter tactics and the big wing controversy. The meeting was chaired by the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Charles Portal. Dowding walked into the room expecting a technical military discussion. Instead, he found himself facing an organized Star Chamber tribunal. Seated around the table were his most vocal critics, Sholto Douglas, Harold Balfour, and Trafford Leigh-Mallory. Crucially, Leigh-Mallory had brought along his star pilot, squadron leader Douglas Bader, to give testimony. Allowing a junior squadron leader to openly challenge and criticize the strategic directives of an Air Chief Marshal and a group commander in a formal ministry meeting was an unheard-of breach of military protocol. Bader spoke passionately about the power of the big wing, presenting exaggerated kill statistics and claiming that 11 Group's tactics were failing. Keith Park fought back fiercely, pointing out that big wings were useless for point defence and took too long to assemble. Dowding sat mostly in silence. He was too tired to engage in a shouting match, too proud to beg for his position, and too convinced of the objective truth of his system to realize that he was being politically executed. When Portal asked for his thoughts, Dowding merely reiterated his long-standing view that different tactics were required for different tactical situations, and that the defense of London required immediate, flexible interceptions. The outcome of the meeting had been decided before Dowding ever entered the room. His enemies had convinced the Air Minister, Sir Archibald Sinclair, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill that Fighter Command needed fresh, aggressive leadership for the next phase of the war. Churchill, who had never fully forgiven Dowding for refusing to send fighters to France in May, offered no protection to his brilliant commander. The execution was carried out with shocking, cold-blooded brutality. On November 24, 1940, Dowding received a phone call from Sir Charles Portal, informing him that he was to step down immediately. The formal letter arrived the following morning. Dowding was given no official reason for his dismissal. He was given no opportunity to address his staff, no farewell parade, and no formal vote of thanks from the government. He was given less than 24 hours to pack his personal belongings and leave Bentley Priory. To complete the political purge, Keith Park, the operational genius who had commanded 11 Group throughout the battle, was sacked alongside Dowding. Park was unceremoniously removed from his post and banished to a non-combat training command, his brilliant achievements brushed aside. And who was brought in to replace them? Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas was promoted to take over Dowding's role as head of Fighter Command. Trafford Leigh-Mallory was rewarded with Keith Park's old position as commander of 11 Group. The very men who had undermined the defence of Britain, pushed flawed tactics, and backstabbed their commander were given the keys to the kingdom. When Hugh Dowding drove out through the gates of Bentley Priory on the afternoon of November 26, 1940, he left behind the institution to which he had dedicated his life. He was 58 years old, unemployed, and discarded by the country he had saved. The Air Ministry, embarrassed by his presence in London, attempted to shuttle him off to obscure assignments. He was sent to the United States on an economic mission to oversee aircraft production standardization, but he was given no clear authority and was systematically marginalized by British diplomats and officials who viewed him as a disgraced officer. He returned to Britain in 1941, deeply disillusioned. In July 1942, Dowding was officially retired from the Royal Air Force. In the years that followed, the men who had ousted him attempted to rewrite the history of the Battle of Britain. Leigh-Mallory and Sholto Douglas immediately implemented the big wing strategy on a large scale, launching offensive fighter sweeps over occupied France known as rhubarbs and circuses. These operations were an unmitigated disaster. Just as Dowding had warned, British fighters operating over enemy territory without radar or ground control were slaughtered by German fighters. Between 1941 and 1942, Fighter Command lost hundreds of aircraft and invaluable experienced pilots over France, achieving almost no strategic objective, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Dowding's conservative defensive philosophy had been absolute right. Yet despite his bitter treatment, Hugh Dowding refused to engage in public mudslinging. Unlike many generals and air marshals of the era who wrote lucrative, self-serving memoirs attacking their rivals, Dowding maintained a dignified, stoic silence. He never publicly criticized Churchill, the Air Ministry, or the men who had betrayed him. Instead, the former Air Chief Marshal retreated into a quiet, eccentric, and deeply contemplative life. Traumatized by the tragic loss of so many young men under his command, Dowding turned his analytical mind toward spiritualism and the paranormal. He became deeply convinced that he could communicate with the spirits of the fallen RAF pilots, his dear boys, who had died in the skies over Britain. He wrote several books on the afterlife, including Many Mansions and Lichgate, offering comfort to thousands of grieving parents and widows who had lost sons and husbands in the war.
To the military establishment, his interest in spiritualism was seen as proof of his eccentricity. But to Dowding, it was a profound, compassionate duty to the young men whose lives he had carried on his conscience.
For years, the official British government narratives of the war downplayed Dowding's role. When the official Air Ministry pamphlet on the Battle of Britain was published in 1941, Dowding's name was barely mentioned. It took years of relentless campaigning by veteran pilots who remembered the man who had protected them and provided them with the technology to survive, to force the government to acknowledge his monumental legacy. In 1943, Dowding was finally raised to the peerage, taking the title Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory. But it was not until long after the war that full historical justice was restored.
Subsequent historical analysis shattered the myth of the Big Wing. Military historians rigorously analyzed combat records, proving that Leigh-Mallory's claims of enemy aircraft shot down were wildly inflated, often by 300%. The consensus became overwhelming. Had Leigh-Mallory's tactics been used during the critical weeks of August 1940, Britain would have lost the war. Dowding's integrated radar network, his husbanding of resources, and Keith Park's flexible tactical interceptions were the sole reasons Fighter Command survived.
Hugh Dowding died on February 15, 1970, at his home in Tunbridge Wells, at the age of 87. His ashes were laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, directly beneath the chapel window dedicated to the airmen who died in the Battle of Britain. Today, a bronze statue of Sir Hugh Dowding stands outside the church of St. Clement Danes in London. His eyes gaze perpetually down the Strand, calm, vigilant, and unwavering. History is often written by the loud, the charismatic, and the politically cunning. It favors the generals who give stirring speeches and the politicians who claim grand victories. But Great Britain did not survive its darkest hour because of political charisma or tactical bravado. It survived because an austere, unyielding engineer named Hugh Dowding built a machine that could not be broken, had the moral courage to stand against his own government to protect it, and refused to yield when the world was burning around him. He was the quiet architect of freedom, the pilot who saved the Western world and was rewarded with silence.